Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today we are picking up again the More Than Reactionary Biblical series, and today's discussion will be on animal welfare and conservation. Now, to start off with, we should discuss the sort of two most salient passages in Scripture to deal with man's relationship to the natural world. First is Genesis chapter 1, beginning in verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. Then God blessed them. God said to them, "Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." The other one is Psalms 24, verse 1, is Psalm of David. "The earth is the Lord's and all of its fullness, the world and those who dwell therein." So the two things that we learn from this to start from is that the world and the created order is owned by God. He owns it. In fact, it's the fact that he owns it where he claims that he has the right to determine the Jubilee laws and the Sabbath laws, because he does own it. And I brought that up in a previous stream. Now, the other thing is that we have dominion over the animals. And this is one of the things that the modern environmental movement and animal rights movement has made a lot of hay with, but that's more because they don't understand what's being said. Having dominion over the animals and the plants does not mean we can just kind of, nuke it and move on. Because we also know that the earth is the Lord's, and we are supposed to be stewards of his resources. So I think the first thing we can extrapolate from this is that while animals and plants and the rest of the environment should serve the ends of man, that does not, one, give man a carte blanche to exploit it indiscriminately for self-destructive purposes. And second of all, if one believes that God owns all the land, then you're going to have a very high incentive to take care of it. Because if you are a capitalist and you want to have a conservationism, well, you only conserve the resources as long as it's profitable. As soon as the conservation of resources ceases to be profitable, you won't do it anymore. The big joke is socialism is the worst destroyer of the environment. One can look at the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a report from Rand Corporation that showed that half the water was undrinkable and half the air unbreathable in the former USSR. So obviously socialism has, well, basically it's the tragedy of the commons, right? If nobody owns anything, then nobody has any incentive to take care of it. And so the Soviet state just exploited the natural world to the extreme. Now, so what we see is that the only system that really gives you a firm grounding in any sort of conservation is the idea that we are stewards of God's creation, because since it is his, and then we identify as stewards of it, you have an independent reason to preserve the environment, independent of the tragedy of the commons and independent of its profitability. So why don't we open with you, Master Sanders? What do they get wrong about dominion and all this?
Well, the often, I guess you could say, the parody of the dominion position was said unironically by Ann Coulter several years ago, when she said, basically, man has the mandate to rape the earth, more or less, is that the resources are just there for the man's taking, and man can just use it to whatever ends he wants. And that's often how that position is portrayed within the media, based in, we've all watched the Saturday morning cartoons with the cartoon capitalist villains doing exactly that thing. And it's often assumed that the dominion mandate is that way. And plus, too, the fact that most social conservatives are in the same alliance or broad electoral alliance with capitalists and market liberals seems to reinforce that notion that the dominion mandate is is more in line with a capitalist, or a parody of a capitalist position, than it is with anything anything resembling stewardship. Now, as you've mentioned, I think the appropriate relationship when it comes to the dominion mandate is that one of stewardship, as you mentioned. Stewardship being that, again, we do not own the earth from a biblical perspective, but we are charged with taking care of it. So man is meant to exercise dominion over the earth and to subdue it, not to exploit it necessarily, but to guard it and to bring out the best in it. In particular, what has been beneficial within the past 30 or 40 years has been the emergence of ecology as a study, showing the relationships that exist in nature between plants and animals and how everything affects the other. And what's often missed, particularly by a lot of environmentalists, is that human beings are very much a part of this ecology, as any plant or animal or microorganism. So, man has a place in nature, and nature needs man as much as man needs nature. So, the problem with the environmentalist position is that it tends to exalt nature to an unreasonable degree, to the point where it's human beings that need to make the sacrifices to the point of uh, uh, population control, such as abortion, euthanasia, discouragement of procreation, etc. So I would argue that, from a biblical perspective, the dominion theology, specifically in reference to the environment and the dominion mandate given to Adam in Genesis 1 and 2, I think it's fairly clear that it's a position of, yes, nature is meant there to serve the needs of man, but at the same time, man's not there to exploit it or just uh, to rape the earth per se, but the environment but man is given charge over protecting and cultivating and enriching what God has already created.
Exactly. What are some of your thoughts on the incentives here, Narco?
The incentives of maintaining the well, I agree with you that we cannot trust either the state or corporations to properly take care of the environment. The maintenance of environmental cleanliness must primarily fall on the people who use it. It's the people who rely on the river and on the soil and air everyone relies on, but the point is it's the people who need it the most have who require the most amount of power in order to maintain it. And this is sort of one of the I think one of the biggest man-made environmental catastrophes regarding nuclear meltdowns. The one of the worst that comes to mind would be Chernobyl, which was a product of Soviet state management, and the other would be Long Island, under the control of a corporation. Anytime you have Central Paris trying to tasked with plants that could have very potential environmental catastrophe, the incentive is not there to properly maintain it because of the distance between those running it and the effects it'll ultimately have. It is the people most affected who have the greatest incentive to curb the abuses. And furthermore, to speak on the right wing in general and its in relation to environmentalism, it's actually, to me, quite funny how environmentalism has become a leftist position. Because back in the days, that just wasn't the case. It was mainly the church through the text you've just recently explored, why they were promoting environmentalism, but also from the monarchy. They were very big on keeping on curbing hunting in these large expanses. Usually the monarch would want to keep large tracts of land you know empty, for his people, and it was considered an affront to the common man to keep the environment fallow or unused, because they figured that was preventing more prosperity, much needed prosperity. And now, since that sort of liberal mentality that originally was the left at the time that promoted anti-environmentalism in favor of the common man. Now they've become the right wing in America, and the socialists, even though you've just pointed out how much environmental ruin came under the Soviet Union, the socialists claim that as their pet project. But I think as we reclaim environmentalism, as we try to fight for environmental cleanliness, we have to balance that again with the needs of the common man, because France right now is seeing the fault of putting the environment over the average person with these emission standards leading to all these yellow vest protests. We have to balance both the prosperity of the little guy with the need to keep the environment clean for our posterity. So balancing of prosperity and posterity would be the political slogan I would give to this.
Yeah.
Oh, if I can interject something real quick, talking about incentives and talking about Christianity and the role of incentives. One thing that I've always been sort of amused with when it comes to those of a more secular persuasion and environmentalism is that if you come at environmentalism from the perspective of Darwinism, the idea of survival of the fittest, and I'm looking out for my needs over the needs of those around me, even if you try to pair it with some level of enlightened self-interest, I don't necessarily see the same justification that makes sense for some levels of environmental protection as opposed to a Christian stewardship understanding. So, for example, one of the mantras of the 80s was, save the whales, right? And from a secular perspective, although technology by the 80s had improved quite a bit, so we didn't need whale oil and things as such, we were at a point in human history where it was either I eat this winter, or I'm heated this winter, or I freeze, or I die because because of the whales. It's more like it's either I live or he lives, right? So there's a definite survival of the fittest going on there, but with an understanding of Christian stewardship, and that creation, to a certain extent, marks or bears the mark of God. Then again, Christians have arguably a much stronger incentive to support environmental protection, more so than you can from a traditionally Darwinistic secular perspective.
Well, exactly. So one of the interesting things that we find is in any sort of Christian understanding of conservation and animal welfare, we also need to look at how God would view these creatures. So the psalmist in Psalms 104:21 says that God feeds the lions. Christ in Luke 12:24 says that God feeds the ravens. So we see that God has this concern for the animals, because obviously the passage in Luke 12 is for our benefit, not the ravens' benefit. But the point is God uses his concern for animals as a sort of foil for his concern for humans. And he's like, look, Jesus is like, look, if God takes care of like the birds, he's going to take care of you guys. Don't worry about it. He's got your back. And so we see that he shows that this compassion towards animal life that we find in the scripture is sort of part of this example here. And we also see that this is interesting too in the Jewish tradition coming out of Genesis chapter 9, beginning in verse 3 and 4 and 5. We read, every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. I have given you all things, even as the green herbs, but you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. Surely for your lifeblood will demand a reckoning from the hand of every beast I will require it, and from the hand of a man. Now, what's interesting about this passage is not only is it the classic, don't eat the blood in an animal, but why is that? What it actually implies is, in practice, the pagan societies around Israel would often cook animals alive. Romans would put a pig on a spit and then just cook it alive. They said it tasted better. The other thing is that you have is with the some pagans would slice off animals' appendages like legs while they're still alive. So we see that there's you can only cook the animal after it's thoroughly dead, i.e. all the blood's been drained out of it. So we see this as actually a massive improvement in the humane treatment and butchering of animals. Rather than dismembering live animals, we wait till they're dead, and then it's permitted to eat them. So I think this is an important concession to the dignity of animals, to the degree that they have dignity. And it's a tremendous improvement over the neighboring pagan societies. In fact, from this one principle, the rabbis have developed an entire principle of charity towards animals, saying that this is indicating that God has a certain sense of, is demanding of us humans a certain sense of obligation to the lower animal kingdom. And that's one of the things that a lot of moderns don't understand, is that just because you are in an authority position over someone or something doesn't then mean you don't have reciprocal obligations to it. So the fact that the dominion mandate states that man is superior to the animals does not mean that man has therefore no obligations to the animals. And Genesis 9, verses 3, 4, and 5 is an example of one of man's obligations to the animals. So what are some of your thoughts on that, Master Sanders?
Well, it's interesting that you bring up some of those examples. One notable example that is brought up in the Torah of some of these practices that God forbade was, you shouldn't cook a kid in its mother's milk. Regardless of anything sanitary, it's just disgusting that you'd even do that in the first place. But that's part of it, right? It goes back to this idea that animals have some level of dignity, that you wouldn't use what would give an animal life and use that to kill it. So, in certain traditions, it's been extrapolated that, you can't have dairy touching meat, but that's a whole nother discussion. But the point is that you're right, God does afford a level of dignity to the animals, even though they may not be created in the image of God per se. In fact, if you look throughout the Tanakh narrative in general, that there is a connection between the well-being of man and the well-being of animals. So a more negative example would be obviously the plagues of Egypt. That is because of Pharaoh's stubbornness and his sin, that you had various animals that were killed, notably the cattle. But also a more positive example, you look at the book of Jonah, and it mentions that when the city of Nineveh repented, it wasn't just the king, it went all the way down to the peasants and even to the animals, that they put sackcloth and ashes on the animals to show as a society, including their animals, that they were repentant towards God. So, even some Jewish scholars have noted that this particular connection between the sin and well-being of man and the welfare of animals. So whenever man is living in right relationship with God, God promises prosperity, at least to the children of Israel. He promises them prosperity in the land, of their animals and of their plants. And when they disobey God, the opposite happens. And when it comes to the welfare of their animals and of their crops. So you're definitely, man does not exist in a vacuum, not just on a spiritual level, but his sin, whether it's toward animals or not, the Tanakh does definitely make or at least put a direct relationship between the behavior of man and how the welfare of animals.
Exactly. So just to back up real quick for Logos' sake, I opened up with the discussion on the dominion mandate, that man has dominion over the animals, and that God owns the earth and we're stewards of it. And I said that from that principle, we can deduce that a biblical foundation for conservation is more reliable than either a state socialist, like obviously the USSR was a disaster, tragedy of the commons, and the private market conservation would cease to conserve if it wasn't profitable. So from those two foundational principles, I opened up with the deduction that people who believe that would be much better stewards because it wouldn't be contingent upon our external conditions. So what are some of your thoughts on what's been discussed, Logos?
As far as the Bible goes, I was really interested in what Master Sanders just said about how the animals kind of inherit whatever man's relationship to God is, even though they didn't consciously, I don't know if the animals have the wherewithal to sin against God, but they inherit man's disposition towards God or vice versa. That seems interesting. I'll have to think about that. But as far as the more general economic concerns, I think the big thing is, does the philosophy put responsibility on the individual to deal with the market, or the environment. Sorry. So, like you said, if it's a socialism thing, it sounds to me like, and this has been borne out by history, if we've discussed in private, that socialist societies just consume and distribute as much of the population as they can, and the populace just the environment's kind of there for our use, maximizing our welfare and society. It's very much a collectivist thing. But in the private market, the capitalist market doesn't seem to be better either. Like you said, the biggest thing I'm worried about with not only the environment but other economic issues as well is passing the buck, where everybody will just say, well, it's some other sector of the environment's problem, or it's the government's problem, or it's this or that person's problem. I'm going to maximize my individual welfare. It's another problem I have with neoclassical economics and not properly dealing with externalities. So from this perspective, the way you've described the principle that it's an individual mandate between every soul and God to exercise proper dominion over the world, it seems to me to avoid the buck passing problem, the tragedy of the commons problem, like you discussed. So that seems to be a pretty good foundation.
Yeah, one thing to add to what Master Sanders said, and I think to further support the idea that our relationship to God in some ways affects the relationship of us to the created order. We read in Romans chapter 8, beginning in verse 20, for the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope. Because the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pains together until now. Not only that, but we are also of the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves grown within ourselves, eagerly waiting for the adoption, the redemption of our body. So what Paul is saying is the redemption of Christ in us, in humans, is for all of creation. So in some sense, the Christian life, the Christian work, it has redemptive qualities to creation itself. Do you have anything to say about that, Master Sanders?
Yeah, not to get too far off, but that's one thing I would say that on a different topic, but that's maybe one thing that premillennialism and postmillennialism, when it comes eschatology, seems to have in somewhat of agreement, that there is going, on some level, whether it's God doing it or man doing it or a combination of both, that creation itself also needs to be redeemed because creation is suffering from the effects of sin. And in the millennium, and how depends on how you interpret that, it seems that a lot of these relationships that were damaged by the fall, and not just between man and animals, but between animals and other animals, there is this idea that the redemption of mankind involves the redemption of the animal kingdom and of creation. So again, that would distinguish it, of course, from more of a traditional Platonic view of matter and reality. But yes, there is very much within Christianity, both in the past and in the future, the hope that creation itself will be redeemed and will be restored to what it was initially intended to be. So there is very much within the biblical text in both the Old and New Testament about the concern for the natural world.
Yeah, is there anything that you'd like to comment on this, Narco?
Well, I'm going to comment, I guess, on the relation we have towards animals. I think there is within the Christian worldview, there is like a great chain of being, a hierarchy amongst various beings, and we human beings created in God's image, we can inherit his rationality, his capacity to do good, and as such, that informs us on our relations with, I guess I'll say, the lower beings, where and there is a hierarchy in terms of how we treat certain beings. So with various animal groups, there is an onus on us to treat them in a certain manner. Now, vegans will try to level all, level the morality amongst all beings, to say that killing stock animal for food or clothing or whatever utility you might have is equivalent to killing a human being for the same thing. that's not accurate because other animals lack the rationality we have, lack the moral standing, and so but that the thing is, there's also a middle ground that just because it's okay for us to kill them does not then mean it is okay for us to kill them in whatever manner we seek fit, to torture them for gratuitous pleasure. This is why the Bible has very very specific instructions on how to slaughter livestock. And as we've progressed, we've come up with new technology that allows us to do it so in a more humane way, because we as humans do have an obligation to try to slaughter stock in a humane capacity to not cause needless pain. And it should also be noted that there's a difference between how you should be able to kill a cow versus how you should be able to kill a cockroach. If you were to gas a whole like thousands upon thousands of cows, like a whole herd, the way you would gas a colony of roaches, that's not exactly on the same moral level, because a cow has much more of a capacity to feel pain than a cockroach does. And so we, being very much more moral and sympathetic creatures, have an object to conduct ourselves in a godly fashion, not cause needless pain. And I think this is what instructs a lot of animal welfare from a Christian worldview.
Yeah, this is interesting. There's one of the ways the Bible teaches a lesson is it teaches a lesson through stories, through parables. And the Solomon in Proverbs 12, number 10, writes, "A righteous man has regard to the life for his animal, but the tender mercies of the wicked are cruel." So we see in the story of Balaam and his ass that in Numbers Numbers chapter 22, verses 32, that after he strikes the ass, the angel says, "And the angel of the Lord said to him, Why have you struck your donkey these 3 times? Behold, I have come to stand against you because your way is perverse before me." So we see that the bad guy is the one who's beating up on the poor innocent animal. And this is probably one of the most interesting analogies to how an animal should be treated. 2 Samuel 12, beginning in verse 1. "Then the Lord sent Nathan to David, and he came to him and said, There were 2 men in one city, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had exceedingly many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb, which he had bought and nourished, and it grew up together with him and with his children. It ate out of his food and drank from his own cup and lay in his bosom, and it was like a daughter to him. And a traveler came to the rich man, who refused to take from his own flock and from his own herd to prepare for the wayfaring man who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. So David's anger was greatly aroused against the man, and said to Nathan, As the Lord lives, the man who has done this shall surely die. And he shall restore fourfold for the lamb, because he did this thing, because he had no pity. Then Nathan said to David, You are the man. Thus says the Lord God of Israel, I am anointing your king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul." And so, ultimately, the larger message of the story of the ewe lamb is that David murdered his own soldier to have his wife. He murdered Uriah to have Bathsheba. We do find that this treatment of the ewe lamb is not terribly different from how often people treat pets today. People have one of the reasons why dog grooming is such a booming business is people have their dogs in bed with them, which seems kind of weird. But then this guy had the lamb eating from his table, sleeping on his bosom, which is not a whole lot different when you think about it. And to kill this lamb was punishable by death, according to David. Now, that's not to say that the lamb has the same rights as a human, but the fact that it was owned by someone else, and that it was. So, for example, in the law, if you killed someone's ox wantonly, you would have to pay, I think, 3 or 4-fold for the ox, but you weren't killed yourself. That wasn't the penalty. So we see that the cruel men are the men who mistreat and kill animals wantonly, and the just men are the men who take consideration for their animals, and even, I guess, have them as pets, even though that might be somewhat anachronistic for, the first millennium BC. But what are some of your thoughts on this, Master Sanders?
I can't really add a whole lot to that, but yes, it goes back to is that, we need to be careful not to make the mistake that, many environmentalists do make, and that's either to put animals on parity with man or in some instances above man. But, the Bible doesn't, I mean, if anything, again, while it doesn't say explicitly, I don't think it's necessarily an unreasonable inference to say that David was correct, or at least the Bible approves of his anger out of hearing this situation. Because after all, David himself had been a shepherd, and he had spent quite a bit of his life as a younger man defending his father's flock from wild animals. So yes, even in some of these minor, you might be considered minor stories or even analogies, it's very clear that there is within Scripture, both the Old and New Testaments, that there is there's a positive sentiment toward, at the very least, positive sentiment toward treating animals humanely.
Yes. What are some of your thoughts on these analogies, Anarcho?
I think that I like how you brought in ownership, especially regarding someone's pets. It's one thing, because it is one thing to destroy someone's property, like someone's cattle that they need to survive on. But I think pets do occupy a certain relationship within people's lives that makes their welfare a bit more. I mean, and it's amazing to see, like, to what degree even like owners will do for their pets in this new age. Like how much medical care. I mean, I remember once seeing an image of someone's duck that was hooked up to one of those life support machines, and maybe that's a little crazy, but the thing is, like, that just goes to show how much more serious, if your cattle's just is getting a little sick and you think it's going to be dead soon, you'll probably put it out of its misery. But your pet, you'll actually go a much longer way to try to save them. So I probably would agree that there needs to be, more legal punishments for damaging or hurting someone's pet than just any other animals someone might happen to own.
Yeah, what are some of your thoughts, Logos, on these analogies?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this somewhat since we talked about these privately a few weeks ago. And one thing that occurred to me that's kind of interesting is how different animals counts as pets depending which society you're in. So, I mean, in one sense, we're trying to talk about this in the context of the dignity of animal life. But in the particular example of the pets, it's kind of like, well, the animals are afforded extra protection based on how people perceive the animals. So it's not necessarily like the dignitarian relationship between animals and God. In a sense, it's the legal ramifications based on how men perceive certain animals to be of higher groups than others. And on this point, I think the vegans might have an argument. There might be an interesting discussion to have there. But on the more general point, I do think that you're right in your interpretation that this opens up the idea that there are more that there's higher dignity classes you can give to animals in general.
Now, one interesting thing, and this gets to a point that Anarcho made in the very beginning, is that animal welfare was basically a Jewish and Christian concept. In the essay, The History of Animal Protection in the United States by Janet M. Davies, we read in the second paragraph, animal protection entered the American colonial record in December 1641, when the Massachusetts General Court enacted its comprehensive legal code, the Body of Liberties. Sections 92 and 93 prohibited any tyranny or cruelty towards any brute creatures which were usable or kept for man's use, and mandated periodic rest and refreshment for any cattle being driven or led. Puritan animal advocates believed that cruel dominion was a consequence of Adam and Eve's fall from the Garden of Eden. Kindly stewardship, however, reflected their reformist ideals, thus illuminating a long history of relationship between religion, reform, and animal protection. We also see in the book, it's called Bloodsport, The History of Hunting in England. We read on page 80. Let's see, is this the right page? Yeah, page 85. The Puritans were haunted by numerous concerns about every aspect of human morality and behavior, including both the wasting of time and recreation and the misuse of the lesser beasts. Hunting and blood sports were therefore obvious targets. In their view, the animals were God's creation. They had been given to man for his use, but not for his abuse. Killing animals for food was a part of God's plan, but to make sport of the process was frankly contemptuous of his creation. Undoubtedly, the religious reformers also disliked hunting for the time-wasting, profanity, and hard drinking and excess with which it was often associated. But it is important to recognize that their complaints went far beyond these moralistic concerns. The Puritans were the first to articulate a consistent and coherent attack on cruelty to animals, a distinction that has rarely been acknowledged by subsequent generations of hostile critics. So this is actually what you could say, these principles in application already. The very fact that we have conservation and animal welfare is the influence of Christians who applied the principles found in the Bible to overall society. So I guess I'll open up with you, Logos. What are some of your thoughts on that?
I don't know. Sounds pretty reasonable. I'll have to think about it further.
All right, Master Sanders.
You know, what you mentioned about the Puritans, it sort of reminds me of a story that's found, I believe, in William Bradford's History of Plymouth Plantation. And this, I don't remember how far along it was in the settlement, but this was probably quite a few years into settlement, and civilization is more or less beginning to crop up. That there was one incident where a young man was caught sodomizing, I believe it was a sheep, and based on probably on biblical law or whatever, that he was executed. I don't remember the means, but yes, even in that sort of strange story that happened in the early days of Plymouth Plantation, that those issues were taken quite seriously.
Yes. Some of your thoughts, Anarcho?
I would definitely agree with Master Sanders that the record of history through most of human civilization, even, and if we even focus on the medieval period, has not been, has been replete with human beings kind of making sport of animals and slaughtering them at without any concern for the pain the creature might be going through at the time. And you don't see a focus on animal welfare throughout the West until the rise of the Christianity, and the Catholic Church lays down some of the first animal welfare laws regarding how to properly slaughter an animal, and what uses, what certain acts are allowed for. I don't exactly know when stuff like cockfighting was outlawed, or dog fighting or what have you, but like I know that the concept, like even the Romans didn't place that much emphasis on the value of a non-human animal, or slaves for that matter, because they used to have them all fight each other, for God's sakes. But yeah, the notion of both human and animal dignity is, for the most part, a Christian concept that came to the West with the rise of the church.
Yeah, like for example, the gladiatorial games were ended where many times animals were slaughtered for sport. A few other regulations from the old Bible that I left out were do not muzzle an ox while stretching out the grain, Deuteronomy 25:4. Animals, along with humans, should rest on the Sabbath, Exodus 20:10, Exodus 23:12, and Deuteronomy 5:14. And then also, do not slaughter a mother and its offspring on the same day, Leviticus 22:28. and gathering when gathering eggs from wild birds, do not kill the mother and gather the eggs on the same day. Deuteronomy 26:2. So this kind of expands the scope a little bit more into a broader conservation perspective. But one of the interesting points on this is John Durant wrote a book called The Paleo Manifesto. I think it's about the paleo diet or something. But he has a chapter called Moses the Microbiologist. And he goes through various health and conservation aspects of the law of Moses. I won't necessarily deal with the health as it regards to humans. That's a separate topic. But when it comes to the animal welfare, for example, many of the unclean animals, especially predatory animals like hawks and ospreys, were really crucial for pest control. So by making them unclean and something you wouldn't eat, it would help keep the rodent and pest population in check. Furthermore, animals that were pests and disease carriers were not to be eaten. So again, we see this broader conservation mentality at work, even this early on. Now, while this is dealing with the laws of warfare, in Deuteronomy 20, verse 19 to 20, we read, "When you besiege a city for a long time while making war against it to take it, you shall not destroy its trees by wielding an axe against them. If you can eat of them, and do not cut down to use in the siege, for the tree of the field is man's food. Only the trees which you know are not trees for food you may destroy and cut down to build siege works against the city that make war with you until it is subdued." Now, an interesting extrapolation from this is that scorched earth policies, which would destroy the environment for some sort of political goal or military goal, could be argued as discouraged from this injunction. We also see in the Revelation 11:18 that God will destroy those who destroy the earth. So we see that with Moses, God gave him a set of rules that had some very common sense conservation aspects to them. I also, in a previous discussion with Keith Preston, got into the Jubilee and the Sabbath in great detail. And of course, that gives the land a break. So you're not overly exploiting the land to the point where it's no longer fertile. So we see a holistic view of how to treat the land, how to treat plants, how to treat animals in a way that is more enlightened than certainly their pagan neighbors. And these ideals carried through the Christian era were then the foundations for modern conservation and modern animal welfare. So I think that in this broader picture, we have a lot of material to work with when it comes to broader conservation of land, not just animal life. And it should also be pointed out that Rhodesia was behind one of the most successful animal conservation programs in history until Mugabe took over and turned it into a poop hole. So that's interesting. One of the and this is sort of an example of how, as you mentioned, Master Sanders, or was it Anarcho, development of resources as well as long-term welfare for people should be balanced. In the 1950s, in Lake Kariba, the Rhodesians built the Kariba Dam, and they had to create an artificial lake which would flood lots of livestock. Well, not livestock, wild animals. And so under an initiative called Operation Noah, the Rhodesians relocated something like 3,000 or 4,000 wild animals to a safe location. In fact, this became famous at the time where one of the female rhinos who had been tranquilized slipped off the raft and, of course, drowned. She was too heavy to dredge out. And her calf was raised as a pet of one of the men who was in the project. And so we see here a balance between the useful development of nature for man's consumption, coupled with a concern for brute animals. And I think that we see with this biblical mandate and these biblical applications that we saw in Rhodesia with the Puritans. I mean, the National Park Service was developed in the late 19th century in the United States. And again, I would not be surprised if there were strong religious incentives at the development of the national park. So what are some of your thoughts on this, Master Sanders?
And just one other note, you're listing off some of these examples. Perhaps one thing that's sometimes overlooked in terms of environmental protection, even in the face of a very much industrialized and capitalistic society, might be England within the late 19th and early 20th centuries with the countryside movement. With things such as, Peter Rabbit, as most people know, was in part meant to promote the protection of the English countryside. While England is one of the arguably much more densely populated and much more industrial than, say, its neighbor in the Netherlands. Even if you go to England today, there are significant amounts of countryside that's useful, of course, for livestock or for farming. That thanks to initiatives taken within a society that did not necessitate a socialistic watermelon approach to the environment, shows that those things can be successful in that kind of environment. Now, let's see. You mentioned. Well, I lost my train of thought there. Anyway, yeah, that's about it.
Okay. Do you have any thoughts, Anarcho?
Yeah, well, I'll just say this regarding I think I was the one bringing up the balance of prosperity and environmentalism. I will say that there have been various charts produced by think tanks such as Heritage and Cato, which show a very direct positive correlation between economic freedom and environmentalism. And that's not to say that capitalism completely unfettered and unregulated to whatever possibility that can even be established, that will always be the best thing for the environment. But it does show that the more you stick to property rights and the more you allow people the freedom to contract and you don't overregulate, then you allow businesses to adapt and to innovate in such a way that they don't require to use up as many resources or to use as many pollutable resources, particularly if the government provides for taxation of said polluting methods, then there may not even necessarily be a trade-off, because the thing is, right, and this is what I have to, I brought up the emissions brought under the Macron regime, the one that led to the protests. That in and of itself will not actually lead to, it won't achieve either environmental goals, and it certainly won't be very good for the working class. So really what has to happen is that if let's say we throw the left a bone on some on government investing in these new natural resources, if we can do so in a way that allows the common man to prosper, to drive growth in a way that allows all these various companies to sprout up, then that could, in a way, achieve both prosperity and environmentalism at the same time. And that would be very good, seeing as how it would achieve both Christian concepts, one of helping the poor just to rise up and materially speaking, and also keeping the environment from being plundered to ruin.
Yeah, I'm actually glad you mentioned the necessity of a respect for private property. Again, to refer back to Rhodesia, one of the most successful animal conservation programs in history. One of the things that was the key shift in policy was under initiatives by the then President Ian Smith. Typically, the large fauna of Africa were seen as pests because elephants and giraffes would trample crops and eat crops, and predators like lions, jackals, and hyenas would eat livestock. So the African peasants had really no incentive to. They were seen as pests. They just wanted to shoot them to get rid of them. But what he did was, part of his insight was to give them some property ownership over the areas they were cultivating. And now all of a sudden they have a financial incentive to protect the animals. And this gets back to the claim that Aristotle made: man takes care of best what he owns, not what he doesn't. So I think that's an important factor. You need to have that alone might not be enough, but that's surely a part of the solution. What are some of your thoughts on this, Logos?
I guess I'll start at the end and work backwards. Your last point about man takes care of what he owns, I think this is right to a degree. I see the logic there, I think it might be able to be weakened slightly to people will take care of what is in their peripheral. When they know something is unsustainable or something's a problem, they could be made to take care of it. But an example against that, though, would be the tragedy of the commons, where people like shared fields and they just bring their animals to graze on it with impunity, and bad things happen there. So I don't know if ownership guarantees that people take care of things, or I don't know that if it's the best hedge or the worst hedge. I think there might be something in the middle to that, but I think it's certainly closer to some of the other societies that we've seen in the past. That's for sure. I guess working backwards still, the other thing that I wanted to note was sorry, my I got some sinus things going on today. The other thing I wanted to note was what I found interesting in the discussion about uh, Protestant sustainability, for example, is I think the true problem or the true missed opportunity, let's put it that way, of Christian environmental regulations, protections, and so on, is a lot of them seem to be marketed as, this is a commandment from God, we'll do it because God said so. And I don't think that as science has gotten better, our way of articulating things has gotten better, and so on, I don't know that it jumped on the idea of sustainability fast enough. So I think there could have been a real opportunity to say, hey, look, God commanded us to do X on the Sabbath, leave the land fallow for a certain amount of years, or let animals rest on the Sabbath, or whatever. And we see societies like, say, the Romans that would leave like some land fallow and then switch off, farming some land, leaving some land fallow, and how that made crops sustainable, and how we failed to do it later on in the Middle Ages and whatever. And farming boomed once we discovered these old techniques. So I think what's tied there isn't just, oh, God said so, it happens to work, so let's do it. But I think we could actually show some patterns of sustainability and show the causal relationships between why these things might work. The one issue I take with a lot of Christian policy and ideas is a lot of them work, but they're so used to making the authoritarian argument, God said so, so we're just going to do it, that they didn't uh, they didn't switch over quick enough to making the pragmatic argument, the well, we do this because argument. And so when they lost the authority in the culture, what happened was people took the narrative out from under them. They had a hard time getting it back. And so that's why when you talk to environmentalists these days, or people who care about the environment, they think it's strictly a left issue. I mean, some people are saying that the environment is a socialist issue, and as you've pointed out, like historically, that's just not the case. And I think a major reason that's the case is because of framing, and and the inability to jump from the authoritarian God said it, let's do it mindset to the here are some good reasons aside from a mindset. And I think in some issues Christians have been working really well on doing it. So Craig is trying to appeal more to the science, for example, for his Kalam cosmological argument. It's not just that Genesis said in the beginning God created blah 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 blah, but here are some of the physics we can try to argue in favor of this. And so slowly I think Christians in academia are doing this with history, philosophy, and so on and so forth. And I think the environment is another instance where they should really be like merging the two together.
I totally agree. That's actually a good analysis there. So I think Master Sanders, you wanted to discuss some possible basically broad initiative concepts that would be compatible with this sort of outlook. Did you have any that you wanted to bring up?
Well, we're talking about the issue of ownership and the incentive to take care of what's your own, right? So I don't know. It's really hard to say which system does that the best when it comes to environmental protection. We know that certain systems do that better than others, regardless of incentives. So, for example, as we mentioned, capitalistic societies, for all the abuses of the environment that can happen and has happened, they seem to have a much better job of doing so than societies that do not. So, for example, Soviet Union having one of the most abysmal environmental track records to date. Now, personally, I think that one of the best ways to do that, as you mentioned with the example of Rhodesia, would be to have more property held by individuals. I think if individuals had more productive property and they would understand the long-term effects of certain practices on the environment when it comes to their living, I think actually we might have more of a social awareness of the problem of environmentalism and the need for sustainability. But that's more on a practical level. But going back more to a philosophical and religious level, which I think you're actually alluding to, uh, the thing is, when it comes to a secular worldview, and you have ideas such as Dawkins' selfish gene, and this really nature being reduced to a struggle for survival among individual species and groups, it really doesn't take into account the reality of the mutualistic relationships that exist within the environment. Again, there's actually more examples of mutualistic relationships that exist within nature than there are parasitic relationships within nature. And any ecologist, environmental scientist, whatever, they'll tell you that. And so, which is why there's been a renewed concern about how certain projects, such as you mentioned, a dam or drilling for oil, whatever, can have an effect on a broad range of environmental issues. So, but from an evolutionary standpoint, the best that you could perhaps justify that would be some level of enlightened self-interest. But even then, that can involve, to a certain extent, cruelty to animals. So, for example, the proliferation of ranches in certain places in the United States, which allow you to hunt for big game animals that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do so in Africa. The upside would be, yes, these animals are being preserved because there's a profit motive to be made from them, but still, it goes back to sort of a barbaric, arguably a barbaric practice of just killing animals for fun.
Yeah.
So, yeah, go ahead.
Well, were you done?
Well, I was just going back to is that again, if you have this understanding that yes, there are, as Logos said, we do need to articulate a more practical application for what the Christian position is. I still think, though, again, from a more Christian perspective and from one of conviction, the Christian has more of an incentive, at least from an inward conviction, to make certain to treat animals with respect, to approach the environment in a certain way, because again, he's standing in the place of God to a certain degree and being the steward of the earth, and not just simply out of pure survival or selfish interest.
Mm-hmm. What are some of your thoughts on that, Narco?
Yeah, I mean, we do have just as much of a theological as much of a consequential motivation to care for the environment, because we can talk about keeping the environment clean just for the sake of keeping ourselves alive, but I find pollution in and of itself to be a kind of degrading the inherent beauty of of the world we've inherited in and of itself, a crime, even if there were no utilitarian defects on our utility, we'd still, for the sake of not just the aesthetics, but for the sake of the fact that we've inherited something, whether you want to believe we've inherited from God or we've just inherited it from life and our ancestors. I think that alone is enough to drive the need to conserve, but to keep the water clean, the air, and not use up the finite resources as much to as much of an extent possible anyway.
Okay, I'm thinking we're about at the end of the allotted time, so I guess we'll start with you, Logos. What are some of your final thoughts on this discussion?
I guess my last quip was close enough. I think that most of this is like a narrative thing. I think you've made a compelling case that that Christianity and Protestantism in general have made good strides toward this throughout history, but for some reason, nobody seems to know or care, or some combination of the two. And I think that's just purely a historical quirk about how the issue has been argued and discussed, where there's been two kind of cultures and two kind of discussions kind of like splitting off and devolving. and one of them kind of just seemed to lose the cultural argument. And so I think once this starts catching up to other ways Christians have made other arguments, I mentioned Craig's Kalam argument and so on. I think we'll start to see a resurgence in interest, hopefully, in how other cultures and other issues have dealt with this, including the Christian ones, much better than we have today. I guess I'll also end just by taking another swing at these utilitarian economists, right? I mean, if you're a secular person that believes in homo economics and stuff like that, I don't even know how you could justify in principle any concern for the environment, because people will always do what's best for their interests, for their environment, for their surroundings. They have rational expectations for the future based on their current consumption, so on and so on and so forth. So it seems absurd to me in light of secular metaphysics and how secular people view the state of man and nature and the economy, that they should think they should have the monopoly on the conversation and the sole seat of the table. It seems weird to have the assumptions they have on the one hand, but then also say, oh, but the environment also isn't working on the other hand. They seem to have no in principle explanation for why it should be the case that this is going on. And I think that could also be exploited to the benefit of people who want to get back into the conversation as well. So I guess that's my final words.
Okay, Narco.
So it seems difficult for me to think how someone could consider themselves a conservative but not advocate for the conservation of natural resources. It seems to me that the only way one could justify wanton use of the environment and destruction of it, as well as abuse of animals, is through the liberal framework that people should just be as free to do as they want, and the collective consequences, deontological consequences, be damned. But it seems to me that if we truly want to advocate for a more socially conservative landscape, environmentalism must necessarily go hand in hand with that. We can't be too concerned with the future of our posterity if we're not willing to keep the ecology free of pollution and keep to adopt sustainable ways of utilizing the world around us. And also, if we don't, it's same with animal welfare. If how are we much better than the third world? Then if we slaughter lower beings than us in such a cruel way, it seems like the slippery slope to turning into some of the countries that we revile so much is pretty much already set in stone. Not, and of course, you can always come up with exceptions, like Hinduism is vegetarian, yet it also advocates for a caste system. But it just fine. I think there's a natural connection between how you treat non-humans, and then how you treat other humans who might be lower than you on the social status pole. I think the two go hand in hand, and if we want to live in a more just society that allows for our posterity to thrive, then conservationism and animal welfare are things we need to definitely adopt in furthering that larger goal.
Okay, Master Sanders.
Yeah, not a whole lot. Just to say is that, again, as Christians, I believe that we have a much more of a greater incentive to take care of the environment and to look out for animal welfare than more so from a secular Darwinistic perspective, because ultimately we know that while animals may not be made in the image of God, they are certainly still part of God's creation. And as such, when as a human being is being made in the image of God, we have a responsibility toward God's creation. And again, regardless of your view of the end times or what their view of the millennium, Christians look forward to the period where man and nature will finally be reconciled after the fall of man, and that again, as human beings, our relationship with our surroundings in many ways reflects our relationship with God.
Okay, I'll just end with, again, Proverbs 12:10. A righteous man regards the life of his animal. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Flight podcast, signing off.